Today, I will present the first of 4 keynotes I would like to share with my audience. These have been prepared and presented at various Bitcoin conferences since November 2024. These presentations weave Bitcoin, education, myths, consciousness, Austrian economics, and time cycles, evolutionary astrology, and human design. You read that right. I am great at synthesizing. Although I have been a public speaker with my artwork for 30 years, debuting as a synthesizer and integrator of complex ideas is my new platform. Today, I'm sharing Bitcoin education beyond schooling and indoctrination. It was first presented at my first Bitcoin, Mi Primer Bitcoin, Unconference on November in San Salvador. I have used the open source curriculum to facilitate study groups for teenagers, women, and curious adults who want to learn about the most important technology of the 21st century, Bitcoin. Over the next month, I will also be sharing Bitcoin as a state of consciousness, presented at Adopted Bitcoin in San Salvador 2 weeks ago, the value of scarce time, Austrian Economics 101. I first shared this in English at the BitBlock Boom in Dallas last April, and recently made it in Spanish at Adopting Bitcoin in San Salvador. And Bitcoin, the Promethean Quest for Individuation and Liberation, which marked my debut as a Bitcoin presenter at last year's Adopting Bitcoin in November 2024. Enjoy. Bitcoin education beyond schooling and indoctrination. My name is Monica Bravo. I am a multidisciplinary artist, polymath, and educator. I'm very happy to be here today, sharing with you some of the most foundational lessons I've learned about value, freedom, and the way we learn. What I want to explore today is how Bitcoin supports a based education beyond indoctrination. It does ask each one of us to understand why we act and to verify what we know through empirical practice, and thus taking responsibility of our individual understanding. This talk moves through 3 threads: how we learn, how we verify, and how we integrate value into itself. I was born into a lineage of progressive women pedagogues. My grandmother founded the first preschool in Colombia in the late 1930s. In fact, you can see her here in this photo with my grandfather and a group of children, including my mom. My grandmother wanted to teach children and funded a kindergarten, taking the name from the German educator Friedrich Fröbel, who coined the word in the 1830s. He believed that children should be nurtured and allowed to grow naturally like plants in a garden, observing, building, singing, and caring for their environment. He emphasized play, creativity, sensory learning, rhythm, movement, and self-motivated activities. He saw beauty, order, as pathways for understanding harmony. He encouraged working with the hands, engaging the senses, and expressing imagination through form and color. He believed that each child carries an inner law of growth that unfolds through freedom and attention. He saw the role of the educator as the gardener of potential, one who tends rather than commands, one who guides rather than instructs. His ideas influenced Maria Montessori, Rudolf Steiner, and John Dewey, who later shaped early education throughout Europe and the Americas, and where both my grandmother and my mom based their own pedagogy. By the 1930s, kindergarten had become an international term representing this philosophy of freedom, play, and guided discovery. My grandmother's vision placed her in direct lineage with that progressive German pedagogy, an education rooted in curiosity, observation, and the unfolding of the child's natural intelligence. My mother named her school after John Dewey. Here, a picture around 1969. She was inspired by his idea that education should not prepare children for life, but to be life itself. Learning for her was a living process, interactive, sensory, and democratic in the truest sense of the word. She believed that learning had to be enjoyable and built the school around ludic practice, learning through play. Her classrooms were alive with curiosity, projects, and conversations. She didn't just teach lessons, she taught us how to think, to question, to participate, and to find meaning through direct experience. John Dewey wrote that education is the foundation of democracy. But what he meant by democracy was not the political structure we now associate with the word. He meant a living system of participation where individuals learn to think for themselves, to act with responsibility, and to coexist through dialogue and shared discovery. What we call democracy today has become its opposite: mass conformity and dependence on centralized narratives. This contradiction stayed with me. It led me to write about how pedagogy, once a tool for individual empowerment, became the vessel for ideological programming. It was never John Dewey's intention, it was the distortion of his ideas. My mother's version of democracy was closer to sovereignty. Education as the architecture of awareness and responsibility. That is what she passed on to me. And that is what I bring to this conversation: education as inquiry, awareness as participation, and responsibility as the foundation of freedom. Provocation literally means to call something forward through voice or action. When I was little, I used to provoke everything around me. I wanted to understand how things worked, so I would push, question, and disrupt. I wanted to see what would happen if I moved one thing out of place. It was challenging, not for the sake of it. I was just simply curious. At home, my mother encouraged that kind of curiosity. She taught me that provocation can be a bridge to discovery if it carries purpose. At school, it became a problem. I was asked to conform, to repeat, and to follow. The tension between freedom and conformity taught me something about education. Curiosity without guidance becomes chaos, and structure without curiosity becomes indoctrination. Now, I see provocation as a creative act, as an artist. That's what I do. I move something, I call something forward, so I can provoke emotion and understanding in others. It is a moment when the tension meets emotion and calls something higher into awareness. Emotional waves, just like financial markets, rise and fall through provocation. They reveal patterns that are unseen yet deeply felt. When I facilitate, I provoke understanding. I provoke inspiration. I provoke storytelling. I see it as an impulse to think, to feel, and to verify. I consider myself a multidisciplinary artist and an empirical polymath. I'm also a polyglot and a very curious human being. My philosophy integrates Eastern, ancestral, and cosmological traditions with psychological inquiry, praxeology, emphasizing liberty, value, resources, and self-worth in pursuing individual and societal service. I'm also an autodidact. My education came through self-taught exploration, research, and direct transmission from field experts and technical practices such as design, photography. This empirical approach allows me to weave multiple perspectives into one synthesis. What you're seeing here are images of my public art projects in places like airports, schools, hospitals, universities, train stations, and police stations. Some are fabricated in mosaic, float glass, or just animated. You can see it in the pictures that I'm a colorist. I use color as contrast to provoke an abundance of emotions that can create a space of self-inquiry. These are all commissions, many under 1% for art programs funded by the state or federal institutions. I am devoted to public art. I thrive when I work with limitations and when I listen to the needs of communities that trust my vision. My installations are immersive, mesmerizing environments that invite people to pause, perceive, and experience connection. There are spaces for awareness. Last year, I published The Nature of My Reality, co-produced and edited by Mari Bunlong. This book traces my journey from disempowerment to self-awareness. Written in a non-linear, deeply personal and self-reflective style, the book invites readers to create space for their own reflection. The illustrations are playful, adding a unique visual element to the text. I'm now writing my second book. The art of synthesis and the architecture of value unfolds through a structure inspired by the human vertebra, a column of perception that holds the body of thought upright and connects the visible and the invisible, the conscious and the unconscious, through which awareness becomes embodied. Through a series of imagined dialogues between myself and Dante, Calvino, Borges, Satoshi, Aristotle, and Cicero, many more, I trace my ongoing inquiry towards a synthesis that integrates and coheres, shaping my own sense of value. Second book will be available around February 2026. Education begins with curiosity and grows through inquiry. Building trust, leading to truth. That's what my lineage, my work, and Bitcoin all share, a system where awareness becomes responsibility. The nature of my reality opened the path for me to express this openly and creatively. The art of synthesis and the architecture of value builds a structure through which I now stand in embodied coherence. For example, what happens is this. Once we start educating people with Bitcoin, something moves. The moment you realize you didn't know how the monetary system worked, that realization itself brings awareness. It brings so much light. And once you have that awareness, you want to act. You want to do something about it. You begin saving and hard money. You start aligning your choices with what you've learned. When you understand how the network works, you also become accountable, because that first inquiry, that first question set in motion the very path that brought you here. Not just as someone learning about Bitcoin, but as someone who is now educating others. Education versus schooling and indoctrination. Definition and distinction. Since inquiry is my base, I continuously ask why something works. I guide through questions, not answers. Education invites inquiry. Schooling repeats. Indoctrination dictates. My task as a facilitator is to hold the space where inquiry becomes understanding. A student may ask, "What is Bitcoin really?" Instead of explaining, one asks back, "What do you think one is?" The student says, "Is it what we use to buy things?" Then another question, "And what gives it value?" Right there, the space changes. Questions deepen the scope. That is education. Inquiry opening awareness. Because when someone arrives at their own understanding, it belongs to them, not to me. Another time, during an art residency, a young artist may ask how to find their voice. Instead of offering a formula, one could ask, "What do you notice when you're really present?" He may say, "Color." Then I answer with a question, "And what does color do to you?" Well, he may answer, "It makes me feel alive." And then, with a response, he says, "Follow that feeling until it speaks back to you." Another educational moment. The inquiry becomes movement. Movement becomes awareness, and awareness becomes their own action. Bitcoin as educational revolution. It encourages how to think, not what to think. To teach Bitcoin through ontology, or how things are formed, through empirical practice or as experience, and dialogue through Socratic discourse, is to return education to its roots: definition, observation, and discovery. I want to make the distinction of a few words that truly embody the roles we can play as educators. I usually call myself a facilitator, not a teacher. Facilitator comes from Latin facilis, to make, to bring about. A facilitator is one who makes something easier by removing resistance. Another meaningful word is guide, to show the way, to know. A guide offers direction born from experience, not authority. Tutor, from Latin tuere, to look at, to guard, to care for, to sustain. A tutor is a protector, Mentor gives authority through empirical practice. A mentee becomes a mentor the day they are ready to pass the torch. From Greek, mentor, the wise advisor in Homer's Odyssey. One who transmits wisdom through presence and example. Learner, from Old English learnen. Get knowledgeable, to be cultivated. To follow a track. Learning is cultivating a line of attention. Lastly, mathematiki, from Greek mathema, that which is learned, and mathin, to learn. In Pythagoras' school, the mathematiki were inner students, those devoted to learning through listening, contemplation, and disciplined inquiry. I see education as a living transmission. Before there were books or schools, knowledge moved through the voice. It was carried in rhythm, in story, in gesture. Storytelling was shaping memory. Through image, tone, and sequence, ideas became alive. They entered the body before they reached the intellect. A story teaches through experience because it speaks to emotion, and emotion remembers. When I facilitate, I return to the oral lineage where learning is participatory through resonance, through the movement of curiosity, when awareness awakens inside the learner and the understanding becomes self-generated. These roles live in a shared lineage. They all serve curiosity. They all honor the learner's capacity to see. Education, in this sense, is a relationship, an art of transmission where meaning travels through presence, through the story and experience. Speaking of storytelling is structure, how new shapes are born. That rhythm is the same patterning language, in code and in the way Bitcoin verifies truth. Each block continues the story of the previous one. Each verification affirms coherence. It is a living narrative of value through time. Transmissions, to me, is an act of care. It is how awareness becomes trust and how trust becomes structure. An example explaining scarcity to my artist friends was very easy, giving examples of the secondary market. Why the prices are so elevated. A Picasso, a Rothko, a Matisse? Because the artist is dead and what is available was converted to assets and traded in markets. A living artist like me can still produce infinitely. That is when I shifted to commission work, only creating unique experiences. You see, a dead artist has no more way to produce work. Therefore, the whole work is scarce, therefore valuable. Transmittere. To transmit is to let knowledge or energy move through a medium or person. The silent passing of understanding through presence, not instruction. Story is a narrative account of events, to inquire, to know by seeing. Storytelling makes knowledge visible through rhythm, an inquiry that turns intuition into articulation, memory into meaning. To invoke is to call inward, to receive what is unseen, to listen for the echo that answers. It is the space of reflection, where intuition meets form. To invoke is to trust the ability to receive a transmission. Humility is the virtue of accepting what one doesn't know. I lived in a world of appearances and pretense, especially during my years in New York. Once I left in 2020, my whole perception shifted. In 2020 through 2022, I created a public art commission for the East Boston Police Department that created 4 hanging glass sculptures and 50 mosaics floating on the walls. In response to the acceptance of this commission and the polarization around the lockdown and police issues, I intentionally chose to study and understand practices of inner reflection, trauma, nonviolent communication, and dialogue to create space for conversation. I attended workshops, applied those lessons within myself, and began integrating them through my work. The workshop was called Dialogos in Action. I invited the community members to engage in play, embodiment, and dialogue. Over 3 days, participants explored emotions, differences, and similarities through animation, movement, and deep listening, creating mobiles that symbolize balance and presence. We opened a space for dialogue between the local community and the police department, creating handmade mobiles with words that became the pieces themselves, such as courage, service, vocation. My aim was to open views that had been closed by passive indoctrination. Real education begins when the individual asks why and takes responsibility for the answer and what comes next. I've been an avid learner, at times self-taught, but like many others with Bitcoin and Austrian economics, I invested in my education and studied with those who know. This empowers me to practice what I know, writing weekly, sharing, and now facilitating study groups. I've used my first Bitcoin open source curriculum since 2023, focusing on online one-on-one study groups with teenagers, women, and family members. I belong to online communities that seek truth, and I've started to bring my first Bitcoin to their reach. I am passionate about facilitating these study groups. Bitcoin requires one to be authentic, just as a running node or miner. Bitcoin education is another layer of how to protect the network. I'm passionate about the opportunity to support through education. This complements my art making practice that keeps me many hours in my studio by myself. Proof of work, action verifying understanding. To provoke is to call something forward, to awaken curiosity through the voice, gesture, or action. It steers movement. When I provoke, I invite awareness to rise. To invoke is to call inward, to receive what is unseen, to listen for the echo that answers. It is the space of reflection, where intuition meets form. Invocation is a discipline of listening. You don't force the voice, you tune into it. A vocation is a calling that unites both movements. It is the dialogue between what we awaken and what we receive. To have a calling is to stay faithful to that resonance once it has been invoked. Facilitating for me lives here. It is a vocation, a continuous exchange between giving form and allowing revelation. Education moves through these three gestures. We provoke curiosity, we invoke understanding, and we embody the vocation of truth. Education calls forward what is already latent within each person, awakening what is ready to be known. The true guide invokes. They become a frequency that awakens remembrance. Bitcoin mirrors this structure. It calls forward awareness. It invites verification, and it sustains a shared vocation of integrity. My family lineage is circling back. My mother taught me to transmit to others what I love the most, and I love Bitcoin. Education begins with curiosity and grows through inquiry, building trust and leading to truth. That's what my lineage, my work, and Bitcoin all share. A system where awareness becomes responsibility. Preserving the link between individual action and collective order. Bitcoin supports authenticity. It is the integration of value. How do I link this to education? I used to say that improvisation is great when you have a good foundation, a structure that is solid and will support you. My first Bitcoin has that structure, and I mentor others in the best way that aligns with who I am, a colorful, curious, and polymathic learner. Bitcoin preserves the link between individual action and collective order, securing property, honoring boundaries, and giving measure to time. A circle of inquiry, connections. Education means one who nourishes or rears, a foster father, a tutor, to bring up, to lead out. The feminine form educatrix means a nurse. Froebel's garden and Montessori's discovery methods. Learning Bitcoin through direct participation and sensory verification. Education, Bitcoin, and life itself share a single rhythm: observation, verification, and participation. So I'll leave you with a question to carry forward. To educate in its oldest sense is to nourish awareness, to lead out what is latent within each human being. What kind of facilitator, guide, or learner do you want to be in the next chapter of your life? One who repeats, one who reacts, or one who listens and questions? Thank you very much.